Marriage is often seen as a sanctuary of love, trust, and mutual respect, a union meant to weather life's storms together. Yet for many, this ideal is shattered by the shadow of domestic violence. What begins as a partnership of hope and dreams can spiral into a battleground marked by fear, betrayal, and pain. Domestic violence is not merely an act of anger, it is a profound breach of humanity, leaving scars that run far deeper than the surface. The effects ripple far beyond the individuals directly involved. Families fracture under the weight of abuse, children grow up in environments of fear, and the cycle of violence often perpetuates itself into future generations. The emotional toll is immeasurable, and the societal consequences are equally devastating. Domestic violence is not just a crime, it is a tragedy that erodes the very fabric of community and connection. The following story tells a cruel and heartbreaking story. The cruel husband took the life of his wife after more than 23 years of marriage. On January 9, 2025, Lucrecia Jaden Sumba woke up just like any other day. The crisp winter morning in New Jersey, where the chill in the air was sharp, but the promise of a new day hung in the atmosphere. For the mother of four, this was a routine that she had mastered over the years, juggling work, motherhood, and the pursuit of a better life for her children. Her husband, Rolando Court, had been a part of this life for over 2 decades. Their relationship, once filled with love and promise, now stood as a testament to something darker. But on that fateful day, something went horribly wrong, something that no one could have anticipated. Lucrecia didn't show up to work. Her absence was more than just unusual. It was unthinkable. For those who knew her, her punctuality was sacred. She never missed a shift at the nail salon in Elizabeth, a job she took pride in, and her colleagues relied on her unflinching work ethic. But that day, she didn't answer her phone. Her boss, Abigail, called multiple times, left messages, but there was no response. The clock ticked on, and a growing sense of unease began to spread through the workplace. It was late afternoon before anyone started to feel the unease in their stomachs. A few whispered doubts turned into a full-blown panic when her best friend Maria, who had planned to meet her later, decided to check on her. What Maria found was not what she expected. The house, always a bustling hive of activity with 4 children, stood eerily still. The door was locked, no sign of movement, no indication that Lucrecia had been there at all. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. The clock was ticking, and somewhere Lucrecia's husband, Rolando, remained mysteriously silent. In that moment, Maria dialed the police, her heart pounding with the dawning realization that something much darker than a simple disappearance was unfolding. And so began the search. As the hours ticked by, the sense of unease grew stronger. Detective Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. There was no trace of Lucrecia. No message, no phone call, no indication of what had happened. The police scoured the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen her. Her co-workers, frantic by now, had started a GoFundMe campaign to help locate her, detailing her warm, hardworking nature and the deep concern they felt. But amidst the search, one key detail came to light, a detail so small, yet so telling. A single security camera near the family's home had captured something that no one expected. In the video, you could see Lucrecia leaving the house at 7:30 a.m. that morning as usual. She waved goodbye to her kids as they left for school, looking as if she was heading to work. But there was something strange about the way she walked. It was almost like she was walking with a purpose. There was no hesitation in her steps, no sign of concern or distress. And yet, the camera cut off before she was out of view. That moment, brief as it was, became the focal point of the investigation. Why hadn't she turned around to check in with Rolando or made any attempt to communicate her whereabouts? But it wasn't just her movements that were puzzling. The house, upon further inspection, didn't show any signs of struggle. The front door had been left unlocked, but nothing seemed out of place. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. Rolando, when questioned again, seemed increasingly agitated. He had been asked multiple times about his whereabouts and his interactions with Lucrecia, but his answers were evasive. "I didn't do anything," he snapped, his voice rising with frustration. "I swear, I have no idea what happened to her. She left, and that's it. I didn't hear anything after that." But Carter knew better. The cracks in Rolando's story were becoming more apparent, and something in his tone made the detective's instincts flare. And then there was the missing piece. The neighbors reported hearing nothing out of the ordinary, but one neighbor, a woman named Clara, remembered something peculiar. She recalled seeing Rolando leave the house later that day, but he was carrying a large black bag. At the time, she thought nothing of it. But now, with the investigation spiraling into a web of confusion, Clara's memory became a key lead. Detective Carter looked at the team around him. "If Rolando's involved, we need to find that bag. It's the only thing that could tie him to this," Carter muttered under his breath. The clock was ticking, and the pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place. The search continued for days, but it wasn't until a tip came in from a local resident in Coopersburg that the case would take a dramatic turn. The call, made to the police at 11:30 p.m. on a Friday, was from someone who had seen something strange: a large black bag discarded at the side of an alley near the 200 South 3rd Street area. The caller didn't recognize the bag, but something about it caught their eye. Detective Carter's heart skipped a beat when he heard the report. The description matched the one given by Clara, the neighbor who had seen Rolando carrying a similar bag earlier in the day. Was this the moment they had been waiting for? Carter and his team were on their way within minutes. When they arrived at the location, the street was eerily quiet. The air was heavy with an unsettling silence, and the only sounds were the distant hum of cars on the main road. The bag lay in a forgotten corner wedged between two overflowing dumpsters. It was just big enough to be concealing something, yet too small to hold anything large. Carter approached carefully, his breath shallow. He knelt down, unzipped the bag. Inside was a macabre sight that stopped his heart cold. At first glance, the contents of the bag seemed innocent: clothes, personal items, and random household goods. But as he dug deeper, a faint, terrible smell began to creep into his nostrils. It was the unmistakable scent of death. His fingers trembled as he reached further into the bag. Beneath the clothes, he found something wrapped in a stained piece of cloth, something hard and unyielding. It was Lucrecia's wallet, her ID, her phone. The sight of her personal belongings lying there like discarded trash sent a chill down Carter's spine. He stood up abruptly, his mind racing. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. This was murder, cold, calculated, and gruesome. Without wasting another moment, Carter ordered the team to sweep the area. They needed to find more. They needed to uncover the truth, and every minute mattered. As the forensic team worked their magic, Carter called in Rolando for questioning once again. He couldn't ignore the gut feeling gnawing at him. This wasn't just a coincidence. In the quiet, sterile interrogation room, Rolando sat with his shoulders slumped, his face pale, as if the weight of the situation had finally begun to sink in. His eyes darted nervously around the room, but he couldn't escape the truth. Not anymore. "Rolando," Carter began, his voice steady, the calm before the storm. "We found something, a black bag. Inside, we found Lucrecia's belongings, her phone, her wallet. You need to be honest to get some relief from the law." Rolando flinched at the mention of her name, his lips trembling. I don't know," he stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure. "I didn't do anything. I don't know where she is." Carter leaned forward, locking his gaze with Rolando's. "We found her things, Rolando. You can't keep lying. You can't run from this. Tell me where she is. Now." Rolando shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his breathing shallow, his eyes avoiding Carter's. But the truth had a way of dragging itself into the light, no matter how hard you tried to bury it. "I didn't mean to," Rolando whispered, his voice barely audible. She was going to leave me. She told me she was done. I didn't know what to do. I was angry, and I lost control. I didn't mean to." The confession hit Carter like a slap. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but there was still a hole. How had it gone so wrong? What had happened in those final moments? Carter stayed silent, his gaze never leaving Rolando. "Tell me everything, Rolando. I need the full story, everything." Rolando's voice wavered, the weight of his words crashing down on him as he began to recount what had happened in the hours leading up to Lucrecia's death. It was clear that the truth was slipping from his lips, reluctant but undeniable. Carter leaned in, his focus razor-sharp as he listened to the unraveling story. "It was late on the night of January 9th, Rolando began, his voice thick with regret. "She had come home from work. Everything seemed normal at first. But when we sat down to talk, she told me she couldn't do it anymore. She was leaving, said she didn't love me the same way anymore. She was tired of my lies, tired of everything." Carter was silent, hands on the table as he let Rolando's words hang in the air. It was always like this in situations like this, jealousy, control, and anger simmering beneath the surface until finally it exploded. She told me she was going to leave me and take the kids, Rolando continued, his voice breaking. She said she was done, that she'd found someone else. I don't remember much after that. I was angry. I lost control. Carter could see it, the all-too-familiar descent into violence that so many others had taken before, rage-blinding reason. He clenched his fist, resisting the urge to react. This was far from over. I grabbed her. I didn't mean to hurt her, Rolando muttered, as though justifying his actions. But she was screaming, pushing me away. I snapped. I hit her, once, maybe twice, and then she went silent. A chill ran through the room. Carter could hear the faint quiver in Rolando's voice, as if he were coming to terms with something darker, something he couldn't escape. Is that when she died? Carter asked, his voice steady but with a touch of fury beneath the calm. Rolando's eyes darted around, and for a split second, he looked like he might crumble under the pressure. I don't know. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do, so I didn't even think. I just put her in the bag. A shiver ran down Carter's spine. The thought of how callously Rolando had discarded his wife's body was almost too much to bear. You put her in the bag? Carter repeated, his voice cold. Rolando nodded. I didn't want anyone to find out. I didn't want the kids to know. I didn't want anyone to think I did it. He shook his head in disbelief. I wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't think it would go this far. But Carter had heard enough. The pieces were finally coming together, and with every word Rolando spoke, he was digging his own grave. It was no longer a matter of if they could prove the crime. It was a matter of when. You think you can just erase what you've done? Carter snapped, his voice rising slightly. You can't hide behind lies anymore. You can't hide from the truth. I've seen enough. We're going to find your wife, Rolando, and we're going to find out exactly what happened to her. Rolando dropped his head, tears finally beginning to fill his eyes. I didn't mean for it to happen, he whispered, his voice cracking. I swear I didn't, but I can't take it back. Detective Carter stood up, his chair scraping against the floor as he moved toward the door. You can't undo it, Carter said, his voice low and final. But you're going to pay for it. With that, he left the room, leaving Rolando alone with his thoughts and with the undeniable truth of his actions. The confession had been made, but the investigation was far from over. There were still details to uncover, evidence to gather, and a family to mourn. Carter sat in the dimly lit office, his eyes scanning the case files laid out before him. The confession from Rolando was damning, but Carter knew that in cases like this, the devil was in the details. The evidence, however minimal, could make all the difference between a conviction and a dead end. He reviewed the forensic reports. Lucrecia had sustained blunt force trauma and sharp object wounds, likely from something she had been stabbed with, though the exact weapon had yet to be found. Carter's mind raced through the possibilities. Was it a knife? A broken piece of furniture? The questions nagged at him, but he couldn't afford to let frustration cloud his judgment. He needed answers. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. A notification popped up. Possible lead on the weapon. Check Coopersburg dump. His heart rate quickened. Coopersburg, the place where Lucrecia's body had been discovered. There was no time to waste. Carter grabbed his coat, heading for the door. The drive to Coopersburg was long and quiet, the weight of the case pressing down on him. It had been a week since Lucrecia had been found dead, and every moment felt like a race against time. The family, the community, they all deserved justice. Carter couldn't afford to lose any more ground. Arriving at the local dump, Carter met with the team of officers and forensic specialists. They were already combing through the massive pile of garbage, looking for any trace of the murder weapon. Anything yet? Carter asked, his voice terse as he stepped out of the car. A young officer turned to him, his face streaked with dirt. Not yet, sir, but we found something interesting. Carter's pulse quickened. What? The officer led him to a pile of discarded bags near the edge of the dump. One of them had been torn open, its contents spilling out. Among the debris was a blood-stained shirt, a shirt that looked eerily similar to the one Rolando had been wearing when he was first questioned. Carter knelt down, inspecting it. It was unmistakable. The pattern, the stitching, and most importantly, the bloodstains that were still visible despite the wear and tear of the fabric. Get this to the lab. Now, Carter ordered, his voice firm. We need to run a DNA test on this. I want it compared to the victim's blood. As the officers bagged the shirt and hurried off to the lab, Carter's thoughts raced. Was this the moment he had been waiting for? Could this be the definitive link between Rolando and the crime? But there was more to be done. Carter instructed the team to keep searching. They needed to find the weapon, and they needed to confirm the blood on the shirt was indeed Lucrecia's. Hours passed as the search continued. Carter felt the weight of the case pushing against him, but he remained relentless. Each clue, each fragment of evidence brought him one step closer to the truth. Finally, as the sun began to set, a forensic officer approached him, holding a small metallic object in his hand. "We found it," the officer said, his voice quiet but heavy with significance. "A knife. Looks like it matches the wounds." Carter took the knife, inspecting it closely. It was stained with dark red blood, and the handle was rough, worn down with use. The blade was sharp, designed for precision. This was the weapon. It was almost too perfect, too clean. It felt as though Rolando had tried to cover his tracks to make sure the evidence wouldn't point back to him. But Carter knew better. The truth was slipping into place like a puzzle, and Rolando was running out of time. Carter took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the coming confrontation. Rolando had confessed, but now he would have to face the full extent of his actions. Carter couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. The case was nearly solved, and justice for Lucrecia was within reach. But there was one final piece to confirm, one final moment that would bring everything crashing down. The dimly lit interrogation room buzzed with tension as Detective Carter walked in, his boots clicking against the cold tile floor. He could feel the eyes of Rolando Court, sitting across from him, boring into him. The confession had been damning, but Carter knew that the final nail in the coffin would come when Rolando faced the truth, fully and completely. Rolando's face was pale, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, something Carter had seen in the eyes of many criminals before: fear, guilt, the knowledge that the walls were closing in. "Mr. Court," Carter began, his voice low and measured, "we have the knife, we have the shirt, we have the blood. The evidence is irrefutable." Rolando's eyes darted around the room, his hands nervously twisting the cuffs around his wrists. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but his voice was strained, lacking the conviction it once had. Carter leaned forward, placing the photo of Lucrecia's lifeless body on the table in front of him. The image was raw, haunting, and it had been burned into Carter's mind ever since he had seen it. "She was your wife," Carter said, his tone soft but cutting. "She trusted you. You were supposed to protect her, but instead you took her life." Rolando flinched, his lips quivering. I didn't mean to," he whispered, the words barely audible. "It wasn't supposed to go that far." Carter's eyes narrowed. "You didn't mean to?" He pushed the photo closer to Rolando. "You didn't mean to stab her? You didn't mean to leave her for dead in a garbage dump?" Rolando looked down at the floor, his breathing shallow. He was breaking, but Carter knew it wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed to hear Rolando's confession, the words that would tie him to the murder. Carter continued speaking, his voice calm but firm. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You beat her, you stabbed her, and then you discarded her like trash. Why? What happened between you two?" Rolando remained silent for a long moment, his eyes glued to the photo of his dead wife. Then finally, the dam broke. It was the pressure, the stress. She had changed when we moved to the States. She wasn't the same anymore, Rolando confessed, his voice trembling. "She didn't love me the way she used to. I thought I could control her, keep her close. But when she started pulling away, I lost it. I couldn't handle it. I snapped." Carter absorbed his words carefully. It wasn't uncommon for abusers to blame their victims, to shift the blame to their spouse's behavior. But Carter wasn't buying it. He could see right through Rolando's pathetic excuses. "You don't get to blame her," Carter snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "You made a choice. You chose to hurt her, and now she's gone. Your children are left without a mother, and they will have to live with this for the rest of their lives." Rolando recoiled, tears welling up in his eyes. He had no more lies to tell. The weight of his actions crushed him. He had betrayed the woman he was supposed to love, and there was no escaping the consequences. "You need to tell me everything," Carter demanded. "How did it happen? What did you do after?" Rolando took a shuddering breath, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I hit her, and when she wouldn't stop screaming, I grabbed the knife. I didn't think, I just wanted her to be quiet. Then I panicked. I didn't know what to do, so I put her in the trash. I didn't want anyone to find out. I couldn't I couldn't face it. Carter stared at Rolando in disbelief, his anger rising once more. This was the man who had claimed to love his wife for over 2 decades, yet here he was, admitting to the cold, calculated murder of the mother of his children. Carter exhaled slowly, his heart heavy. The confession, while it sealed Rolando's fate, didn't bring back Lucrecia. It didn't undo the pain he had caused. It didn't heal the wounds of her children, who would now have to live with this nightmare forever. But at least Carter thought justice was coming. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. "You're going to pay for what you've done," Carter said, standing up from the table. "You'll never get away with this." Rolando's head dropped, his tears falling freely now. He knew it was over. He knew he was going to prison and he would never see his family again. The walls had closed in, and there was no escape. The weight of the investigation began to sink into Carter's bones as he walked out of the interrogation room. The truth had been exposed, but it didn't bring the satisfaction he had hoped for. Lucrecia was gone, and no amount of justice could undo the devastation she had left behind. Carter glanced at the clock on the wall of the precinct. It was late. The office was quieter now, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound in the otherwise empty room. He couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered, something just out of reach. He'd solved the case, but the emotional toll of the crime still gnawed at him. He found himself replaying the words Rolando had said. "I just wanted her to be quiet." It echoed in his mind like a broken record, chilling him to the core. He thought about Lucrecia, her bright eyes, the way she spoke of her children with such love and care. The woman he had learned about in the investigation had been reduced to a statistic, a victim of domestic violence who never had a chance to escape. He couldn't help but wonder, what if someone had intervened earlier? What if someone had listened to her? Carter leaned against the table, rubbing his face with both hands in exhaustion. The case had been straightforward, but the emotions wrapped around it were anything but simple. He thought about the children Lucrecia had left behind. They would have to grow up without their mother, without the woman who had been their protector and guide. It was the cruelest punishment of all, the innocent victims who would carry the scars of their father's violence forever. Carter looked up, his gaze falling on Officer Daniels, who had been part of the team working on the case. Daniels was young, eager, but Carter could see the sorrow in his eyes. It was clear that the case had affected him too. "We finished reviewing the records," Daniels said, handing Carter a folder. "Rolando has a history of violence. He had been in and out of counseling for years, but it never helped. His temper, his controlling behavior, it was all there, and yet no one saw it coming. Not even his closest friends. No one knew how far he would go." Carter took the folder, flipping through it. Each page revealed another layer to the nightmare. Domestic abuse, psychological manipulation, a man with a history of violence who had somehow kept it hidden for years. "It's like he was a ticking time bomb," Daniels added, but no one heard the warning signs, not even her. Carter closed the folder with a soft thud. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The streets were bustling with life, oblivious to the darkness that had occurred just hours before. It was always like that, he thought. The world continued on, regardless of the chaos that had just been uncovered. But for those who were involved, those whose lives had been shattered, there was no moving on. There was no going back. "You can never predict this kind of thing," Carter murmured, his voice low and distant. "You think you know someone. You think they're just like you. But then one day you realize they're capable of anything. They're capable of destroying everything, even the person they supposedly love." Daniel stood silently, absorbing Carter's words. He knew that feeling well. It was the feeling that haunted detectives, that gnawed at their consciousness long after the case was closed. "But we do our best," Carter continued, his voice gaining strength. "We stop the cycle, we expose the truth, and we make sure it never happens again." The courtroom buzzed with tension. The air felt thick, as if the weight of the tragedy was pressing down on everyone present. Carter stood at the back of the room, his eyes fixed on Rolando Court, who sat at the defendant's table, stone-faced and unmoving. His expression betrayed nothing, but Carter could see the cracks in his composure, a man on the verge of losing everything. The trial had begun, and it felt as though the entire community was holding its breath. It wasn't just a trial about Lucrecia's death, it was about the years of manipulation, the silent screams of a woman who had been bound by love and fear. The prosecution's case was airtight. The evidence, the witnesses, the chilling confessions Rolando had made, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. He had killed Lucrecia. But despite the mounting evidence, there was something unsettling about this trial. It wasn't just Rolando's silence that made the air thick with discomfort. It was the way he refused to take responsibility, the way he sat there denying everything. Even now, after everything that had happened, he maintained the same cold detachment. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor began, their voice clear and commanding. "This is not just a case of domestic violence. This is a case of a man who took his wife's life in the most brutal and callous way possible. This is a case of betrayal, of a man who chose violence over love. And in doing so, he left 4 children without a mother who was loved, who worked tirelessly to give her children a better life, and who in the end was robbed of that future." Carter clenched his jaw, the words hitting him harder than he expected. It was all true, every word. He could still hear Lucrecia's laughter echoing in his mind, her love for her children, the hope she had held on to. And now her future was nothing more than a memory that Rolando had stolen from her children, from everyone who knew her. The defense attorney stood up, attempting to deflect the blame. "Your Honor, what we have here is a tragedy. A man who has been dealing with years of emotional and psychological stress. A man who snapped under pressure. This was not a premeditated act, but one of sheer desperation. Rolando Court did not intend to kill his wife. He was a man pushed to his limits." But the words felt hollow. Desperation? Maybe. But murder was never a result of desperation. It was a choice to take a life rather than find a solution. And Rolando had made that choice. A choice that had forever altered the course of so many lives. The jury listened intently, but Carter could see the skepticism in their eyes. The man before them, the one who had once been a loving husband, was now a cold murderer, and no amount of pleading would change that. Carter's heart tightened as he watched Rolando's expression. Nothing. There was no remorse, no regret, just a man who had gotten away with his crime for too long. The final day of the trial arrived, the air thick with expectation. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with people eager for the moment when justice would finally be served. Detective Carter stood at the back once again, watching, waiting, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment of truth, the moment that would define whether Lucrecia's death would go unanswered or whether her killer would face the consequences of his actions. The jury had been deliberating for hours, and Carter knew how crucial this moment was. It was more than just a conviction. It was the closure that Lucrecia's children desperately needed. The truth had been laid out for all to see. The evidence was undeniable. But, like many cases, there was always a chance that doubt could cloud the minds of those who had to decide. The judge entered the room, his somber face signaling that the jury had reached a verdict. The silence was deafening as everyone stood. Rolando Court's face remained expressionless, but Carter could see the faintest tremor in his hands. He was afraid, and he should be. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge's voice echoed, breaking the silence, "we have reached a verdict. In the case of the state versus Rolando Court, on the charge of first-degree murder, how does the jury find the defendant?" The foreman of the jury stood up, the weight of the room on his shoulders. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder." The words hit like a thunderclap. A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom, but it was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it was cold comfort for the children who would never see their mother again. Rolando didn't move. His face remained impassive as the reality of his fate began to sink in. He had lost. He had lost his freedom, and most painfully, he had lost the chance to ever undo the damage he had caused. His life, once full of opportunity, was now forever tainted by the blood of his wife, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Carter felt a small wave of vindication wash over him, but it was fleeting. He had done his job. He had uncovered the truth. But it didn't bring Lucrecia back. It didn't erase the pain of her children, the trauma they would carry for the rest of their lives. And in that moment, Carter knew that the real work had just begun. For justice to be truly served, it wasn't just about the conviction. It was about helping those who had been left behind. As the courtroom began to empty, Carter approached the victim's family. He caught the eyes of Lucrecia's children, standing together in the back of the room, their faces etched with sorrow and loss. The oldest, a young woman in her early 20s, met his gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The weight of what had just happened was more than enough. She simply nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. And with that, Carter knew that Lucrecia's story would never be forgotten. She had been taken from this world too soon, but through the determination of the investigation, her killer had been brought to justice. It wouldn't undo the years of pain, but it would serve as a reminder that no matter how cold and callous the world could be, there was always someone willing to fight for the truth. As the courtroom doors closed behind him, Carter looked up at the sky. The storm that had raged for so long had passed, but the scars remained. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel something other than the relentless pursuit of justice. It was grief for Lucrecia, for her children, for the lives that had been broken by one man's actions. And yet, there was still hope. In the quiet of the courtroom and in the faces of those who had loved Lucrecia, he found something that would carry him through the darkest days to come. Justice had been served, but the fight for healing was only just beginning. The downfall of a family begins with the erosion of trust, respect, and compassion. Domestic violence is not just a private matter. It is a profound act of betrayal that leaves emotional scars, shatters relationships, and creates a cycle of pain that can span generations. It is a crime against the very foundation of love and unity that marriage and family stand for. The consequences ripple far beyond the home, impacting mental health, self-worth, and even the well-being of society. But there is hope. By acknowledging the problem, seeking help, and fostering dialogue, we can break the chains of violence and rebuild trust. Together, we can create homes that are sanctuaries of peace, love, and understanding. If this message resonates with you, show your support by liking this video. Your engagement motivates us to create more meaningful content. If you have questions or thoughts, drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more insightful videos. Together, we can make a difference.